Srinivas Bangarbale has been the Chief Data Officer of the Commodities Futures Commission since October 2011, where he was responsible for data, standards policy, analysts, operations, and architecture. He currently serves on the expert group and work groups for the international implementation of the Legal Entity Identifier, the LEI. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Srinivas Bangarbale.
I don't know whether it's good morning or good afternoon because I think we're at noon. I'd like to start off with saying why data is important to the CFTC's mission. As it was introduced, I've been at the CFTC for a little more than 3 years, and we did not have a data office before. So I was tasked with setting up the data office and tasked with implementing many key data standards and identifiers for the agency in the wake of the last financial reform under the Dodd-Frank Act. And the CFTC used to be a small agency. It still is a very small agency by many standards, and used to be managing a fairly limited futures and options markets. 2008 and 9 changed all that. We, in the aftermath of the last financial crisis, we were given tremendous responsibility under the Dodd-Frank Act to supervise the swaps marketplace, which is complex, which is global. And so we had to come out of our mentality of managing markets which were in one region of the world to managing markets that now stretched across the world, to work more collaboratively with our regulatory colleagues from across the globe. Why did data matter to us? So the mission of the CFTC is to foster open, transparent, competitive, and financially sound markets, to avoid systemic risk, and to protect the market users, their funds, and the consumers and the public. Why is data then important? So there's a saying in project management that what you cannot measure, you cannot manage. So if we are managing a market that's as complex and as global as the swaps market or the futures market or the options markets, then we have to have data to manage. We should know what we're managing. We should know what a good functioning market looks like, and we should know what a non-functioning market looks like. We should know when a market participant is filing information that's valid. We should know when they're filing information that's invalid. But we cannot do that if we let everyone do their own thing. So we have to be part of a movement that encourages standards. So with a view of improving the way we implement standards, the first thing we noticed was in the swaps marketplace under Dodd-Frank, there were 3 key identifiers that we needed. One was the identity of who was trading in the marketplace. Believe it or not, in the global marketplace, there is not a single identifier that tells you who is trading in the financial markets. It could be company X, it could be company Y. Company Y could be a subsidiary of company X, or company Y could own company X. You would not know. So, with the work that was done in the Office of the Financial Research and in the industry from 2009, 10, and 11 onwards, the concept of the legal entity identifier was born. The CFTC signed on very early on from September of 2011 into the LEI work. So from September of 2011 to the January of 2013, the Financial Stability Board in Basel ran 2 different work groups to implement the legal entity identifier. So in January 2013, the legal entity identifier formed an international regulatory oversight committee, of which CFTC is a charter member, and we also serve on the executive committee, and I serve on the executive committee on behalf of the CFTC. So we explicitly call for the LEI in our rules for swaps reporting, and our plan is that as time goes by, we would extend that to the other data streams that we get. The other key identifiers that you need to manage a financial marketplace are what is being traded and is there a transaction identifier? Neither of which currently exist on a global scale today. So what's being traded is called a product identifier. The CFTC, again, is part of an international work stream that's now run by the Committee for Payment and Market Infrastructure, CPMI, and the International Organization of Securities Commissions, IOSCO. They have a joint work group that's working on defining a unique product identifier, and eventually that work is expected to be transferred into the Financial Stability Board, which will start working on implementing a global unique product identifier. The CFTC is, again, a very full participant in this work. Myself and along with some of our staff are on all of the work groups that relate to UPI. The third one is the transaction identifier. We knew early on when reporting started, it was December of 2012, that without a transaction identifier, we could not understand what was happening in the swaps markets. So we released an interim standard called the Unique Swap Identifier, which is called for in our rules. And that interim standard has worked really, really well. But we are also cognizant that many of these transactions are global in nature. So the same transaction that's reported in the US might also get reported to ESMA in Europe. It might get reported to ASIC in Australia or JFSA in Japan. And if we all use different identifiers to track the same transaction, then one, we won't know what the size of the market is because they will look like 3 or 4 different transactions when there's only one transaction. 2, we won't know whether they are the same transaction. And if we just imagine a world where market participants can trade in any market, can use any identifier they want to identify themselves, can use any product denomination, and can use any transaction identifier. It's total chaos. We're not there. It's because the regulators, including the CFTC, have gotten together to solve the LEI problem and have gotten together to solve the other problems. So in the next year or so, we should be done with the problems of product identifier and the transaction identifier for the swaps marketplace. Now, it doesn't mean that it stops there. Actually, there's a lot of work to be done for all 3 of them. They need to be extended back to our traditional markets. For the CFTC, it means the futures marketplace, and it could mean the equities marketplace. And I know all our fellow regulators in the US and in international locations are working on extending the reach of these identifiers across their reporting streams. CFPB recently put out a rule proposal saying for mortgage disclosures, they want to use the LEI. The National Association of Insurance Commissioners is requesting LEI. The SEC requires LEI in its swaps reporting. The Federal Reserve has put out a proposed rulemaking for investment banks asking for LEI for its NIC database. So we are part of this movement of making sure we use standards. But standards don't stop at identifiers because every transaction we get has to be consistent with the transactions that are reported elsewhere. When 2 market participants send 2 different transactions, they have very similar characteristics, then you want them to have very similar data. And that's not going to come without standards. One of the downsides of how quickly Dodd-Frank legislation was written and how the rules were passed because there was no other way was that the data standards took a backseat at that time. So we're now in catch-up mode. We're now in the process of working with the international community. Again, CPMI and IOSCO have an international work group. We also have what we call the data harmonization work stream for swaps data, where we are working to define unambiguously the swaps reporting data. We're working to define the data elements. We're working to define the conditions under which what kind of data should be reported. It's amazing that a complex multi-trillion-dollar marketplace actually operates even today without sufficient data standards. And it's not just true of the regulators. Even in the marketplace, there are competing standards. Not every market participant follows the same standard. Sometimes market participants have trouble understanding the trades they're going through. In fact, in 2008, a lot of the market participants did not know who their counterparties were and who owed them money and who they owed money. The LEI, as a result, has a lot of demand in the industry because the industry wants the LEI to succeed. And I think all the financial regulators have a great leverage there because it's something the industry wants. And even in the other identifiers, the industry really wants these to be implemented so they have a better handle on their own trades. So the CFTC is engaged in a number of initiatives, and Tony Scott talks about taking planes off. So we have taken off a whole squadron of planes in terms of data standards initiatives, in terms of identifiers, in terms of working across the seas with our fellow regulators to ensure there are consistent standards and consistent reporting. We, as with other regulatory agencies, are resource starved. So it takes a lot of focus and a lot of effort on our part to land all these planes safely. And it's very important to land these safely because the financial health of our markets is at stake if we as regulators get good data and can understand the data and can manage these markets well, then the public can be confident that we know what we're doing and that we are managing these markets well and that their money is safe. So there's one more thing that the CFTC has done, which no other regulator has done, at least outside of the US, is in the swaps market, we have a public reporting component to it. Not only just a public reporting and on a weekly basis, which the CFTC puts out, but also a trade-by-trade public reporting. Every transaction, every swap transaction that happens in the United States is published by the swap data repositories, which collect the data on our behalf publicly within 15 minutes of the trade being reported. And we call this the Part 43 public reporting rule. And this is unique. If you survey authorities across the world, ask them if they have trade-by-trade public reporting in the swap space, very few of them do. The CFTC is unique in having implemented this in the last 3 years. We've had this, and it's been very useful to researchers. But one of the things that will help with better data standards is this data would be available to everyone on a standardized basis, as opposed to this being put out by multiple trade repositories or swap data repositories in their own standard. So we're less focused on standards per se as whether they're FPML or FixML, but we're more focused on having consistent meaning, definition, and content of the data we get. And having this data, as I said, is very critical to the mission because if we want to manage a market well, we need to have good data. So I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk about the CFTC's work in progress in the data standard space. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
We'll take one question. We've got one right here, and then hand up. There you go. Stand up. There we go. There we go. Question.
Coming from the fixed income market, which I know is a little bit outside of the world of CFTC, but one of the problems that we have is the QSIP identifier, which is used for all the bonds and related instruments, is a proprietary identifier. You have to not only pay to get an identifier, you also have to pay to use and redistribute the identifiers.
Right.
Would the product, the unique product identifier that you mentioned possibly be a substitute for that?
It could be, though it's a little too early to say that. So the unique product identifier workstream had an industry workshop, a public industry workshop in Basel, Switzerland last month, actually earlier this month. And it plans to release consultative documentation in the next few months to come. So I would urge everyone, there will be 3 documents that will be coming out in the next several months. One on data elements, the second one is on product identifiers, the third one is on transaction identifiers, and I would urge participants here and your colleagues to please review these documents. They'll be available from CPMI and IOSCO to look at these documents and provide your comments, because that's the purpose of this consultative documentation, is to seek a written input into the process.
Srinivas, everyone's trying to land a plane, so good luck. to you. Thank you for the trust that you're building at the CFTC and for your insights today.